You know, they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but if I'm going to do that with this one, then yeah, I'm sold. Folklore on PlayStation 3, also known as Folk Soul in Japan. This box art is a straight vibe. I love it. But more so, I really enjoyed the demo on PSN years ago, much like I think a lot of others did, just that I did not buy it. I didn't get my copy until last year, and it's really interesting in that this game did review well at the time, which was an important time. This was the first year PS3 was on the market, but all these years later, and all we have is one entry in the franchise and the reputation of it being a PS3 hidden gem. I use air quotes because I think a lot of people do know of the game at a cursory glance, but when it comes to actually playing it from top to bottom, there's so much more here, so this is Folklore on PlayStation 3. Take a look. I am ready to try Folklore after all these years. This game always spoke to me, and so I think I'm in for a treat. The game starts off with a journey to a lighthouse. There's always a man, there's always a lighthouse. Wait, wrong game. The game starts off with a cutscene showing the young university student Ellen on a boat approaching a lighthouse. She explains that she lost her mother when she was young and has no strong memory of her or her childhood. But recently she received a letter from her telling Ellen she's alive and to meet on the cliff of She in the village of Doolin. Then we cut to Keats, a journalist for the occult magazine Unknown Realms. He receives a phone call from a woman in trouble asking for help, saying fairies are going to kill her, and to come to the village of Doolin on the cliff of She. As Keats storms off, the camera closes in on an open magazine with a piece on Doolin, labeled The Village Where People Go to Reunite with the Deceased. Keats arrives in Doolin with Ellen already approaching the cliff of She, where she finds someone sitting on the edge. When Keats gets there, he asks Ellen if she's the one who called him, but during this, that person on the cliff slumps over, revealing they're dead. The body falls over the cliff, and Keats delivers this cheesy but appropriate line.
A murder in the village of the dead. Tell me this is a joke.
Before getting to gameplay, we now have to make a decision for what is this game's atypical approach to its plot. Already I'm met with a bit of a dilemma here. Keats or Ellen? Both are intriguing, but I'm inclined to say Ellen for the time being. Folklore is a story of both Ellen and Keats, and it's not simply a matter of choosing which one to use for a given chapter. You play the near entirety of the game from each perspective. That means there's a prologue for both characters, and a chapter 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, and these perspectives do run concurrently, meaning Keats' chapter 2 is simply seeing what he was doing during Ellen's chapter 2. The game allows you to progress these at whatever pace you wish. For example, you could play multiple chapters of Ellen before getting to Keats, but for context on my playthrough, I began with Ellen and then did Keats, alternating until the end. You'll see why later this might not be the best decision if you want to avoid repetition. Getting back to the story, Ellen makes her way to the beach to find who she thought was her mother, and this is where we see Folklore's comic book style storytelling in action. There's no voice acting here, it's all speech bubbles, but the real-time scenes that are in these keyframed panels I just love, especially with this entrancing soundtrack that sets the mood perfectly for this dark fantasy. Here we see a bystander speaking with Ellen, and then suddenly Ellen passes out. When she awakens, a voice tells her that she could find her mother and to make her way to the village's pub. When she arrives, she's met with half-lives, beings that are between life and death. They tell her that she can meet the dead and to meet Scarecrow, who's waiting outside, and who's also been waiting for this day to arrive. Scarecrow tells her to go to the Henge, which is south of town. At the Henge, he informs her that today is Samhain, a prayer day for the dead, which allows her to go beneath the Henge on this night only. Once there, Ellen is told to don the cloak of She. Ellen with the glow up! Literally, I feel like I put on a dress for her. Ellen has now traveled to the Netherworld and she's currently in the Fairy Realm. Here's where we get into the moment-to-moment gameplay, which is primarily action combat in a dungeon-crawling map layout. The main hook here is that all the fauna you encounter can be absorbed once defeated. Successful attacks are indicated when you see blue IDs coming off enemy folks, and when they turn red, you can absorb them. This is done with 6-axis motion. You flick the controller upward to absorb the folk. Once completed, you can immediately start using that folk for your own attacks, which you map to the face buttons. There's over 100 different folks in the game, with a wide array of attributes. They can be elemental based, fire, ice, wind, ground. They can be short range, mid range, long range. Some are combo based, some just let off a giant single attack, others are area of effect, then there's ones for guarding or status afflicting ones, and all of these play as you'd expect, where you need certain folks to effectively deal damage to others, or some are needed for the bosses. Later in the game, these had a few problems which we'll get to, but I was loving the designs, and I had audible excitement getting to a new realm and seeing what the folks were going to look like. Ooh, what are these things? Ah, this is a new guy. Volcano. Whoa, what is that? It's a flying book spider thing. Oh, that is so cool. Whoa, look at this thing. Oh. Eventually, Ellen reaches the dead woman who she thinks is her mother, but instead is met with hostility, where this woman blames Ellen for something and wants to kill her. Ellen is ejected from the netherworld, and if she wants to return, she needs to find a memento and offer it to the henge. For Keats, we see that he arrived at the beach shortly after Ellen passed out, speaking with the bystander. Keats then tries to get some rest at a new hideout when he too is summoned to the pub by a mysterious voice. He's a lot more skeptical of what he's seeing, but the half-live Belgae tells him to visit the henge, and Keats humors this lead, but we quickly see he's here for one thing only. Keats is a very motivated man. Let's get down to brass tacks here. How do I get the scoop? How do I get the story? I am here to get the story. I'm on the beat. Belgae says Ellen is a new messenger, one that can travel between the real world and the netherworld, and Keats, bearing witness to Ellen's donning of the cloak, allows him to be a guardian and acquire the same ability of netherworld travel. Keats then works his way through the same fairy world path and watches Ellen's conflict with the mysterious woman, who is named Regine. Keats then speaks with her, learning that she's not Ellen's mother, and that she was, quote, unable to settle that score from 17 years ago. Regine says her daughter Suzette is in the village and asks that she be told to leave, or else she'll be killed too. Keats then runs out of time and is also ejected from the netherworld. Before proceeding, let's provide some background on the developer Game Republic. They were founded in 2003 by the prolific video game designer Yoshiki Okamuro. In his early years, he designed Gyrus and Time Pilot at Konami and eventually landed a career at Capcom, directing a handful of arcade games and serving as a producer on Street Fighter II. His 1985 arcade game Gunsmoke also led to some direct influence and involvement with Angel Studios, working on a Wild West-themed game, which eventually went on to birth the Red Dead franchise under Rockstar Games. Okamuro had actually left Capcom in 1997 and founded Flagship, a studio that immediately got off the ground from publishing and contract agreements with Capcom on a number of big IP like Resident Evil and Kirby with Nintendo. But 2003 is where he left Flagship and started Game Republic, and their first game was Genji: Dawn of the Samurai, published by Sony on the PlayStation 2. Many might be more familiar with its sequel, Days of the Blade, thanks to the giant crab battle meme from the PS3 days. But after that, Folklore was next, directed by Yoshiki Okamuro himself and Takashi Shono. Folklore received some support from Japan Studio, Santa Monica, and the Visual Arts Group, and the game was originally titled Monster Kingdom Unknown Realms, which was supposed to be an ongoing series, with the first game called Monster Kingdom Jewel Summoner, developed by Gaia. But poor sales of that game is what made Folklore get its own new standalone title. Though developer Gaia did directly work on the folk designs in this game, which some of them made their way into Gaia's next game, Koretsu Uketsugureshi Idea on the PSP. Folklore is heavily influenced and based around Irish folklore, something Okamuro felt wasn't nearly as well known as Roman or Greek mythology. The game did review reasonably well, and Game Republic went on to ship a few more games, working on the Dragon Ball IP, and new titles like Majin the Forsaken Kingdom and Knight's Contract. However, Game Republic closed in 2011, almost suddenly, with rumors going around that Okamuro was in debt and not in the best headspace. Okamuro does admit, too, that Game Republic scaled up from doing launch games since platform holders are eager to fund projects early on for their new hardware, but this also means bringing in younger talent with less experience when you scale up so rapidly. Okamuro personally discussed further on his YouTube channel that he feels the game had a few problems, like the motion controls, complex story, and PS3 install base. He also feels the game is hard to describe in simple terms, but he does recognize the game is sometimes considered a hidden gem. Regardless, the hope for a Folklore sequel was always there, with a PSP game or a downloadable Move-compatible title being pitched, but they never quite got off the ground due to Folklore's lackluster sales. Okamoto went on to retire from console games, and then designed the wildly successful Monster Strike on mobile. Now, getting back to my playthrough, in the village, both Ellen and Keats in their separate chapters meet with Suzette and learn she had a troubled upbringing. She was abused by her mother, locked inside the house for months, and was sometimes accused she killed her older brother. Ellen learns that on the night of Samhain 17 years ago, Suzette's father fell over the cliff and died, and then after that, her mother left the village. No one knows what happened, but Suzette assumes her family was always twisted. Keats discovers a family photo hidden inside a ceramic doll from 17 years ago, and Suzette is surprised to see her mother looking happy because the only mother she knew was a monster. Suzette gives both of them a different memento, letting Ellen and Keats offer it to the henge at night so they can netherworld travel again and meet the dead. Now the game is more opened up as you begin to work through the fairy world proper between the characters, and you also get an idea of the gameplay loop between the two, which is largely the same. For all the folks you acquire, you can expand their abilities based on a variety of smaller objectives, which I initially did for Ellen, but then you find out none of that sticks to Keats. Like, I just straight up don't want to fight these things. It's like the third time I've gone through this beginning area. So I guess I'm just gonna skip past all these. But like, there's a benefit to fighting all this stuff, right? Because then you can upgrade the folks that you have, which for Keats, yeah, I lose the progress I had with Ellen. I don't know. I gotta do all this over again, right? He doesn't have all the things Ellen has. Now, surely one would think differences come up to keep the experience fresh, and that's true to a degree. Some folks are exclusive to each character. Yeah, okay, so this is unique to Keats. I didn't see this with Ellen. So at least this keeps a little bit fresh. For the folks that both characters encounter, they will have different upgrade conditions and also different attack patterns. Generally, you'll find that Ellen has more defensive folks, whereas Keats is more offensive. That and Keats has an extra ability called Transcension, which is more or less a temporary rage mode you can activate. Okay, that's when Keats looks like this white dude. Very cool. Oh, geez. I just kind of like did that on my own there. Eventually you'll encounter tankier folks or the bosses, and these will have special absorption motions. The first one is timing based, flicking up when the id turns red. Got him. Then there's the beat based one, where you rock the controller from left to right. Then a balancing one, where keeping the controller leveled progresses the bar. That's a weird one. And the extremely annoying stop and go one. Oh my... Come on, dude! Are you actually kidding me? The worst fishing game ever. I'd rather play Rapala fishing. Oh my god, I'm so close to pulling in this bass. Are you fucking serious? Dude. Let's go! Stop stopping. Actually, how did that get through? Back in the fairy realm, Ellen meets with the Fairy Lord, where he tells her she must defeat the Folklore to retrieve the memories she seeks. This is the end boss for each realm, and they'll require specific folks to take down. You'll usually find a picture book page that tells you what you'll need, and this extends to other folks throughout the game that you might have trouble acquiring. Okay, so I need the Barghest, which I have, and the cat with the blades on its head, and then the bird with the elemental wind. And yes, this also means you fight the boss twice for each chapter. When you defeat this Folklore, Ellen and Keats materialize to the pub, which is just a self-perceived meeting room for the memories they extracted, as explained by the talking deer head that has the hots for Ellen. Either way, Ellen gets to meet with Ronaldo and Keats Regine. Keats learns from the family photo that Ronaldo is Regine's husband and Hervé is her son. Regine was still pregnant with Suzette at the time she left the village, and some kind of tragedy at the church happened with her son Hervé. Then a bug-like creature appears called a Nemazine. These feed on the memories of the dead, and when they burst, they provide the flashbacks necessary to make sense of this story. Someone named Ryan breaks bad news to Ronaldo about a tragedy at the church involving their son Hervé, so it's revealed Regine is the one who wrote the letter to Ellen pretending to be her mother and asking to see her at the Cliff of She, doing this hoping for revenge. Ronaldo says much the same, that Hervé was murdered, and Ryan, the lighthouse keeper, told them about what happened at the church. The Nemazine shows Ronaldo accusing a little girl about what she did to Hervé, but then somehow falls over the cliff. Before he dies on the beach, he writes a letter to leave in a bottle. When Ellen goes to retrieve the bottle with Suzette, it reads, After Keats discussed his findings with Suzette, he gets the feeling he's being watched. Who is that? Ellen is now wondering what happened 17 years ago that caused this tragedy, and how it may involve her and her lack of childhood memories, so she begins asking around. Excuse me, have you heard of my name, Ryan? The lighthouse keeper Ryan. I remember him well. He was murdered? Ryan died too? Harriet was quite close to Ryan, I believe. Oh, Harriet. She's over here, is she not? Harriet explains Ryan was murdered in the graveyard because someone asked him to be there, and she gives Ellen a memento, the right half of a torn photo, and she says to visit the hut on the cape near the lighthouse where Ryan worked. During Keats' chapter, you'll find he's slightly behind Ellen since Harriet already gave her the torn photo. She tells Keats to speak with the pub owner who reconfirms the tragedy 17 years ago. So, like, a lot of people died. It was a tragic night. Yeah, we just don't talk about it. The pub owner says people thought it was the Hag, a goddess from mythology. When Keats visits the hut up north, he finds the left half of the torn photo and finds Ellen outside as she's about to visit the hut herself. They connect their photos, and we get this wonderfully atmospheric main theme composed by Kenji Kawai that plays during this pivotal moment. During Ellen's chapter, you have the option of giving Keats the photo, which I agreed to in my playthrough, but the end result will be the same in that offering the photo to the henge at night, Ellen will follow Keats and they both enter the netherworld into a new realm called Warcadia. At this point, a few things were sticking out to me when it came to the dungeon crawling sections. Like, why would I not use the Barghest? It does so much damage. Sometimes it's like I get a new folk and I try it out and I'm like, okay, well, this one's lame. Because, like, there's a few that are already kind of really powerful as is. So the experimentation is there, but I keep falling back on the ones I like. Man, leveling some of these up are just tedious. Like kill 5 bullseye with the Barrager, and it's like it takes this long for just one of them. Just a pain in the ass. And then by the time I get to Keats, it feels like a total reset, because now Keats doesn't have any of these. Oh yeah, I forgot he has these ones too. Forgot he's got different stuff, and I gotta do all these things all over again. During Keats' chapter, he meets Levane, who explains the Fairy Lord has cast a spell on Ellen that helps the fairies travel between realms since they're unable to do so normally. For now, it's implied the Fairy Lord has ulterior motives, and also this finally gets answered in a unsatisfactory way. Ellen and I came to Warcadia at the same time, so why didn't we meet each other? Yes, I would love to know this. Why? What's going on here? Human concepts of time and space mean nothing in the netherworld. Oh, okay. The dimensions you perceive here are purely subjective. Ellen's cloak has also given you power. So, like it or not, there is a bond between you and Ellen. You're likely to meet up with her in the netherworld. If I'm likely to meet her here, then why didn't I meet her here? No clue, but the game will conveniently meet them up later. For now, Ellen and Keats fight a new Folklore, twice, and after they get to meet Ryan. Between the two of them, they collectively learn Ryan and Harriet were at the church graveyard and saw Hervé and Dr. Lester. It was then Harriet who took the photo. Ryan asks Keats to tell Dr. Lester the fairy is back, and then a Nemazine flashback shows Ryan pleading with Harriet that she's mistaken, and that Dr. Lester has a heart of gold. Harriet asks Ryan to get the truth out of her, but to also be careful because she may have a fairy guardian. With Ellen, we see her flashbacks reveal Ryan with the same little girl that was at the cliff with Ronaldo, but something causes Ryan to be killed here. Back in the village, Ellen's meeting with Harriet leads to reminiscing about Ryan at the graveyard, but with Keats, Harriet reveals Ellen is special, that she wanted to test a theory, and that Ellen was in this village 17 years ago. In the next chapter, as Keats, you visit Dr. Lester to give him the message, and he is shocked to hear this. As Ellen, you also visit Dr. Lester and walk in on Keats and the doctor at this very moment, and he is still surprised with an obvious familiarity to Ellen, and he tells Keats to come back later that night. When Ellen tries talking to the doctor asking about the murders, he immediately shuts her down and refuses to talk about it, even accusing her of tormenting him. When she leaves, Mrs. Lester says she can tell you what happened 17 years ago. Apparently, her relationship with her husband fell apart when the tragedy happened. She doesn't know the details of the tragedy, but she does recall a boy who died suddenly, a boy with a terminal illness who still had time to live. Mrs. Lester suspects her husband is covering for someone, and when Ellen asks if the boy was Hervé, she confirms it was. So Ellen goes to the Netherworld pub meeting room with the deer again, who's pretty psyched to see her. Here she encounters the little girl Cecilia, who is Hervé's friend. She tells Ellen to find him and that she hid treasure at the ash tree. As Ellen is leaving, she spots somebody familiar. Lester, what are you doing out here? Is he in the... He's in the fairy realm! What are you doing? Oh my god, I don't want to stand up. He's here because during Keats' chapter, when he tried to come back at night, Dr. Lester was missing. And when Keats looks around the village to find him...
Who? Who is it?
Who dat?
He's dead.
Who indeed? Time for the mystery guest to make an entrance.
Back to Ellen, she returns to Doolin and checks the ash tree near the hut up north, and she finds Hervé's medical records and Cecilia's picture, two lovely mementos that we'll need for netherworld travel. But first, the chapters converge when Ellen meets up with Keats and the rest of the villagers, all taken aback by Dr. Lester's murder. O'Connell, one of the locals, thinks it's the hag, saying a strange woman has been lurking around. Later that night, Ellen and Keats meet at the henge, and Keats says the murders of the past and present are linked, and the villagers are hiding something. Using the mementos, they travel to a new underwater realm. Ellen sees the Fairy Lord again, and he reveals they seek the Netherworld core, and that if Ellen reaches it, it will reveal her past memories. But 5,000 years ago, someone broke a law in the Netherworld, and the Fairy Lord wants it corrected. Keats, however, encounters Hervé. Apparently Hervé is a fan of the magazine that Keats writes for, and he tells him that he's going to the Swamp of Oblivion. That way his entire existence can't be forgotten. Further up the realm, Keats then runs into Lavaine, and she explains the swamp will erase the memory of that person from everyone's minds. And then suddenly, everyone meets at this fork in the road: Ellen, Keats, the Fairy Lord, and Lavaine. It appears the Fairy Lord and Lavaine are in war with each other. Keats. Oh, now, this is like what, the first time Keats and me are seeing each other in the Netherworld? You are a curse upon the Netherworld. They're like, what, two opposing factions between Ellen and Keats, and we're both being manipulated by these people? How many, look, I'm like, Keats is on her side. I'm just here for a good story. And poor Ellen's just roped into all this. She just wants to know about her past. Keats tells Ellen that Hervé's headed for the swamp, but the Fairy Lord insists that Ellen needs to fight the Folklore at the palace. So here's where you get to decide which one you want to do, and that determines where the other one will go. The end result, story-wise, is similar, but you do get some unique dungeon paths to explore between the two characters here. I chose to chase Hervé right away as Ellen, so Keats then goes to the palace automatically. This doesn't change the end boss though, just the scenery. Although it is worth mentioning, the folk differences continue playing a role, where you need to utilize different ones between the two characters. After this, Hervé and Dr. Lester meet again, and the doctor is afraid of seeing Hervé, saying he failed to save Cecilia as well, and that he should be the one forgotten. But Hervé responds saying Cecilia is alive. The doctor is initially taken aback by this, but is then relieved. After that, the doctor peacefully disappears, and Hervé tells Ellen that it was difficult for him knowing how much pain he caused the doctor. Ellen now feels more confident that her roots are in the village, asking what happened at the church, and Hervé says he can't say. That she would be better off not knowing, but he does reveal there's a tape in the desk at the church. Also, the Fairy Lord is still loitering around, thanking Ellen for her work, when she's really just doing this for herself. Yeah, for real, dude. Like, I'm not on your side with your fucking giant nose head ass. For Keats, Hervé says Dr. Lester wasn't scared of his condition, but he has a favor to ask. The doctor wrote a will, and he wants to make sure Mrs. Lester does not see it, and that Ellen remain uninvolved. Lavaine is also loitering as well, telling Keats to watch himself, and he too has to clarify he doesn't have anything to do with her. Back in the village, Ellen and Mrs. Lester listen to the tape, and Hervé says Dr. Lester taught him the preciousness of life, and he owes it to him and Cecilia for embracing what they have given him. Mrs. Lester seems surprised that Hervé did not despise her husband, and still doesn't know exactly what happened. She also mentions if Cecilia were still alive, Ellen would be about her age, but before Hervé died, she came to the clinic with an injury, and she was initially saved, but then the murders happened, and she left the village with her mother. They then received a letter shortly after informing them that Cecilia had died. When Keats gets to the church, he's surprised to see the door unlocked, but eventually finds the will that proclaims 17 years ago Dr. Lester set off a chain of events that caused much misery, and that the recent deaths are surely related. Not able to bear this, he claims he will take his own life. In the following chapter, Ellen talks with Harriet and asks about Cecilia. Harriet says Cecilia made a fairy prayer. Legend has it that whoever prays at the henge for 9 days will have their wish granted, and that Cecilia could see fairies. Harriet tried to find out what Cecilia saw beneath the henge, revealing that Cecilia suffered a serious injury there that should have been fatal. Harriet says she will reveal more after she talks with Keats and tells Ellen to speak with O'Connell. O'Connell says his girlfriend Lulu has been missing for a week and that she was trying to get underneath the henge, so O'Connell gives Ellen a memento so she can investigate. This begins the Endless Corridor level, which is the home of Lavaine. In the beginning of Keats' chapter, there's a note outside his hideout from Harriet saying it's time she tells him everything, but she was murdered. Son of a... Just when I thought Harriet was going to give me what I wanted to know, she actually dies right here. Strangled? Once again, O'Connell suspects it's the hag, so Keats acquires the memento that lets him into the Endless Corridor, hoping to meet Harriet and gather more info. He eventually reaches the pub meeting room where he asks Harriet what she saw in the church 17 years ago, and she says it was Hervé, dead, with Dr. Lester next to him. Cecilia was also there, covered in blood, but she wasn't photographed because Harriet was afraid in the moment. Harriet explains that she was convinced Cecilia could see fairies and had their protection, and Harriet, being a former actress who had an accident and had to quit, eventually got into the occult and came to Doolin after hearing fairies exist. She apparently wanted their protection. She tells Keats to protect Cecilia, and when Keats says he doesn't even know where she is, Harriet responds, "Yes, you do." Near the end of the realm, Keats finds a Nemazine which shows a letter in the church. Back in Doolin, Mrs. Lester shows a letter saying it was from Ingrid, Cecilia's mother. This is the hastily written letter that claims Cecilia had passed on. Back to Ellen, she encounters Fer de Rig, the half-live that regularly appears in the pub at night. They hint that Lulu might be beneath a henge, and after this, Ellen eventually reaches Lavaine and is told to go back to the village to face the depth of her fears. When she returns, the villagers and Keats are at the church mulling over Harriet's death, which Ellen just now learns. This trauma triggers her memory, and she recalls the door beneath the henge. Here, it's finally said out in the open. Once back at the Endless Corridor, Ellen defeats the Folklore, this one created by Lavaine herself, and Ellen reaches a realm version of the Henge. The Fairy Lord is here, and he reveals Lavaine as a messenger, just like Ellen. Lavaine had the responsibility of telling dwellers of reality about the Netherworld, so that ordinary people would be reassured about their fates after death. But one day she backed out of her responsibility and disabled one of the twin trees in the Netherworld core, the tree that controls human subconscious. Keats more or less has the same path here, defeating the same folklore, arriving at the henge, and learning the same info from Lavaine herself. Back in the village proper, Keats enters the henge and finds the knife used against Dr. Lester, but also a portrait of a woman that looks like Ellen. For Ellen, she lets O'Connell know that Lulu might be underneath the henge, and they wait until nightfall, offer the medallion, and open the henge. Inside, Ellen finds Lulu's earrings where the mummy and the cloak were, which circles back to Ellen's original donning of the cloak. It turns out the mummy was Lulu, and even though O'Connell told Ellen she's been missing for a week, he lied. She's actually been gone for 6 months. Distraught over this, O'Connell storms off to the Cliff of She, where it looks like he's going to end it all, but instead comes to his senses and apologizes to Ellen. It's not totally clear here, but basically Lulu donned the cloak and she was a messenger, but optional dialogue throughout the game discuss messengers that die or don't make it very far during Netherworld travel, unlike Ellen thus far. Anyway, he tells her there's something he can try to shed light on her lost memories, that something being hypnosis. O'Connell starts to question Ellen, and she begins recalling her childhood, like how Hervé had an incurable disease, and that Cecilia, or Ellen, learned about fairies and how if she prayed for 9 days, Hervé will be saved. So she did just that, and then the final day was Samhain. It cuts off here because apparently Ellen passed out, and O'Connell did videotape the session, but for whatever reason doesn't want to show Ellen, so she just waits until nightfall and breaks into his house to view it. Also, Keats does the same in his chapter. Anyway, we finally get another voice-acted cutscene when the videotape is played.
I remember it clearly. On the day of Samhain, at the fire festival, I used to go to the ruins each night to say a prayer.
Can you remember? What was it that you saw inside them? Try to stay calm. You set foot inside the ruins. And then?
I saw something in the darkness. It was a fairy.
You saw a fairy?
I saw.
This opens a new realm, and when Ellen asks why she's here because she's not actively pursuing a memory of the dead, Bogle, the Fairy Lord's war general, says she either had a desire to come, or Hellrealm gave her and Keats an invitation. Also, Scarecrow, the half-live that's been Ellen's pseudo-sidekick this whole time, says Lavaine and Keats aren't the only people to be concerned with. Just keep that in mind for now. Going through this area, both Keats and Ellen, in separate chapters mind you, reach the Fairy Lord, where he expects Ellen to reach the Netherworld core to remove the spear from the Twin Tree. Since Keats has been more openly opposed to the Fairy Lord, there's an argument that plays out here. Okay, and all that's over. So where'd Keats go? How did things work out for the best? What happened? Where did Keats go? Things like these just, they bug me. How did that not... Nothing about that worked out. Now I gotta play Keats to see the same thing play out, and then nothing happened. The folklore for this level is the Judge of the Netherworld. There's a really great cutscene that plays out as Ellen is caged and brought into the courthouse to stand before the judge.
We foul birds at your service. We bring you this here accused.
Excuse me, but I'd like to interview the defendant.
Both Ellen and Keats fight the folklore, separately in their chapters of course, and then it ends with them both there, conveniently. This time, however, there's no dead person we're pursuing. Ellen walks over a bridge full of Nemesis, and then Hellrealm denizens piece together what Ellen has been overlooking this entire time.
You told us you met and spoke to 3 dead people.
But since this is not the afterworld, but just a figment of your imagination, how would you know anything about these people?
The answer is simple. Because you knew about them before they died. You had talked to them in the past.
No!
You never met any dead. You only revived your memories of them. 17 years ago, there were 3 strange murders.
You witnessed their deaths. You alone heard their voices.
It's me. I did it. I killed those 3 villagers 17 years ago.
So you finally recall the truth, eh?
Not quite. Ellen begins to relive her time in Doolin as a child. We see her learning about Hervé's condition, that he only has about 1 year to live. We see her learning from Harriet about praying to fairies for 9 days. We also see the night of Samhain, where the henge opens up on this night only, on the 9th day of Cecilia's praying. She went inside, and a voice told her to give blood, so she cut her wrist, thinking this would lead to Hervé being saved. Then we see her with Dr. Lester, where he says she suffered an injury, and when she asks about Hervé, the doctor simply says that her mother will come for her soon. We then relive the moments of Ryan and Ronaldo's murders with Cecilia. Ellen realizes that it was Dr. Lester who hid the truth, and that it was Ellen responsible for the deaths. For Keats, back in Hellrealm, he watches Ellen walk off and have that self-reflection manifest on its own. She falls over the bridge, but then Keats begins to hear Cecilia, saying, "Mother told me to hide beneath the henge." She sings a nursery rhyme and says, "Come quick." Keats returns to Doolin to go under the henge, this time with Suzette. Approaching the door that leads to a deeper chamber, he surmises that the nursery rhyme is the key to opening the door. Sure enough, it opens, and they come face to face with the hag. This is normally where a chapter select would happen. The hag. Chapter 6. Don't have to pick between Ellen or Keats, we're just going straight in. The hag runs off, but doesn't get very far. Oh, there she is.
You! No!
Suzette! She's out cold.
Ellen. Ellen.
Now I finally understand your true intent. Why you came to this village in the first place.
Please, help my daughter.
What? She looks super young. Keats is sent off to experience Doolin's past through the Netherworld. Hervé asks Cecilia about her mother, and she says she works overseas. Hervé says Cecilia should be a painter, and asks if she's finished drawing him. He says, "Don't forget to make me look cool. I'm going to be a writer, just like my dad." This begins a sequence where Keats has to unlock memories by completing arena-style levels where you fight off folks from all the realms you've encountered. When you finish one, you get a new memory. A much clearer one that finally outlines what transpired 17 years ago. Hervé and Dr. Lester at the henge, discovering Cecilia's near-fatal wrist cutting, that she thought she was going to save Hervé, Ryan, the lighthouse keeper, telling Hervé's parents about their son's passing, how Harriet had told him Cecilia must have killed Hervé since she witnessed her covered in blood at the church clinic, then Cecilia leaving the clinic and going to visit Hervé, but instead being met with hostility from his parents. Then seeing Ronaldo confront Cecilia on the cliff of She, but it was Ingrid, Cecilia's mother, who pushed him off the cliff. Then we see Ryan aggressively approaching Cecilia, asking how she met the fairies. She storms off, and Ryan gives chase, leaving Ingrid to return after trying to hide her daughter in this hut and realizing she's gone. They make it to the graveyard where Ryan grabs Cecilia. Ingrid catches up and kills Ryan. After this, Ingrid hides Cecilia in a deep chamber of the ruins, promising she'll be back. Keats at this point makes it to the real Ellen in the Netherworld, where she's now rescued. We then switch to Ellen and get a smaller scale boss battle that eventually unlocks another memory. Hervé's mother, Regine, vowing her revenge. Ingrid tells her daughter that she'll have to leave the village and she'll need a new name. Ellen finally comes to in the real world to finally meet her mother.
I couldn't stay with you, but I swore to myself that I would always protect you.
The fairy that watched over me was you, my own mother. Why didn't I realize it sooner?
I'm sorry to put you through such an ordeal.
No, not at all.
And to have left you all alone. I'm so glad you're alive.
Why did my mom die? She was fine like 2 seconds ago. Yeah, so this wasn't exactly clear, but Suzette apparently did get a good stab in before Keats knocked her off. Anyway, the final chapter opens with Keats letting Ellen know that Regine must have figured out her whereabouts. Ingrid then caught wind of this and killed Regine right before Ellen and Keats got to the cliff. The second and third murders were from Suzette, who started to dig into the past and understand who caused her so much misery in her upbringing. There's side quests that better explain her motives, but on the gold path, this is what the player is told. Keats also explains that Ingrid was simply trying to help Dr. Lester when she was caught with a knife at the henge. Anyway, Ellen still plans on heading to the Netherworld core because she wants to know what it is she saw at the henge that asked for a blood offering on the night of Samhain. And thus begins the final realm where you have the option of playing between Ellen or Keats, except this is a singular chapter. And we can't forget the Fairy Lord who wants to sever ties with the living. Levane appears and explains this would cause the human spirit to collapse under the burden of such pain. Since Ellen and Keats agree that's not a viable option, you initiate a boss battle with the Fairy Lord. After this, there's another boss battle with Levane from Ellen's point of view, which seemed a lot more out of place considering the Fairy Lord fight had everyone on Levane's side, but Scarecrow was the primary instigator here. Keats encounters a Nemesis that shows Cecilia talking about the drawing she did of Hervé when he's older, then Ellen gets to the twin trees deep in the Netherworld core, Levane and Boggle make their cases for if the spear should be removed, and Ellen, wanting to know the truth of what really happened to her, finds the Nemesis that finally reveals the truth.
Hervé, you do understand your ailment.
I'm no longer afraid of death. I was once. I was terrified.
But we must tell your parents.
Cecilia must live. When I was so lost, she extended her hand to me. She gave me strength. Doctor, have no doubt. This is my only wish.
There weren't many people in the village, and only Hervé had a matching blood type with Ellen. Given he had an incurable disease, Hervé insisted he be used for a blood transfusion that would save Ellen's life. And Dr. Lester, wrought with guilt from his decision, felt even worse when Ryan and Ronaldo were killed as a consequence. With Ellen now knowing this, she decides the spear stuck in the twin tree shall stay. The game can't end yet though. It turns out Scarecrow was born from Ellen's desires and fear of death, so he turns into a giant amorphous crow monster that Ellen gets to duke it out with. Pretty standard boss fight stuff, using a variety of different folks to properly deal damage to its various crow ligaments. After this, we see Scarecrow was created shortly after the tragedies occurred, deep within the henge. And who was it that asked for a blood offering? It was Levane.
My duty is done. 5,000 years was a long time. Ellen, if ever someone is hurt or in anguish, enter the Netherworld and help them. Farewell, Ellen.
As the story's wrapping up, Keats wants to find out one last thing. He discovers an issue of Unknown Realms and realizes the last issue was 17 years ago, right around the time Hervé passed away. And what was the drawing Cecilia did of what Hervé would look like when he's older? The man just disappeared. We see Ellen visiting Keats, who is a half-live in the Netherworld, where she says her final goodbyes.
I'm glad I went to Doolin, because that's where I met you. Goodbye, Keats, and thank you.
Brilliant. This is fabulous.
Is that it? Credits roll? Yeah, Melissa was standing in front of the credits. All right, there we go. Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that. A lot to unpack. A lot of my assumptions didn't turn out to be the case for where the story was going. Some aspects were right, but this is definitely one of those stories where I want to kind of, before I even say anything here in the moment, sort of run through everything. I feel like there's some continuity, not errors or problems, but I don't know, I'm all frazzled here. I want to take this all in, so, but that is Folklore on the PlayStation 3. So I feel like a lot of what I showed conveyed that I wasn't having a good time, which is not true. So I almost really loved this game, and I say almost because there was just enough there to keep me from really committing on that. I can see how somebody would try this game and put it down for a myriad of reasons, primarily the one plot line told from two perspectives. It's very much playing the game two times. The perspectives are not different enough. You're going through the same levels, most of the same enemies, the same boss fights, and contextually the game does try to explain that away, but you know, as we saw, it's a lot of it doesn't quite land for me personally, but there's that, and it really depends on your tolerance and also how you approach those two perspectives. You know, it probably is a lot better to beeline one path, go for that hard stop, and then go to the other character, and it doesn't feel that much of a problem when you lose everything. So something as simple as a shared skill tree would have gone a long way, or preferably having those perspectives be much different. But the gameplay is also very inoffensive. You know, it's not bad, but it's also nothing to write home about. So while there is 100 folks and there's a lot of experimentation, you're gonna settle on 3 or 4 of them that you really like, because the vast majority of those folks are either samey or just not that useful, and that's why you wouldn't use them in combat. So there's a lot that do, I think, bring Folklore down, but you know, the entire package is there, and it did work for me in a very big way. Even more so, the soundtrack, which is incredible, and I don't know when I will ever replay this game, but when I do, and I do plan on doing that, I will make sure to use headphones. The soundtrack is incredible. Plus, there's a lot of side quests, there's DLC on PSN still, so there is a lot to see and a lot more you did not get to experience from this video, but Folklore certainly is a fascinating PS3 game, one that I had the pleasure of finally going through. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you're a Patreon supporter or a YouTube channel member, there's going to be deleted scenes, basically an extended cut with all my gameplay without the narration you can check out. That's coming soon. And also, if you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter @MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.